Hello, studio teacher friends. Welcome to your weekly source of solidarity, otherwise known as the Beyond Measure podcast. I am Christina Whitlock, your host and self appointed anytime piano teacher friend. This is a welcoming space for all studio music teachers where I think out loud about pretty much every aspect of our work. Sometimes I dive deep, but today's episode is ultra practical. I am dedicating today's episode to the many of us who are currently in the throes of preparing for performances of some kind. Rest assured, even if you are not currently gearing up for performances, I do believe today's episode holds a lot of value. So I hope you enjoy. We'll get on with the show now. You are listening to episode 165 of the Beyond Measure podcast. Cheers to changing perspectives before performance. The other day, I walked into my 13-year-old daughter's bedroom, and my nose was assaulted by some really strong perfume smell. I was like, "What have you sprayed in here?" To which she insisted she had only put a tiny spritz of something on her wrist to see what it smelled like. To me, I couldn't even think straight. It seemed so strong. So I booked it out of there. Over the course of the next few days, every time I walked into her room, I thought the same thing. Like, blech, I am not a perfumey kind of person anyway. And we have several people in our family who are ultra sensitive to smell. So we just don't go there. But why am I even telling you this story today anyway? Well, every time I told her how terribly strong the perfume smell was, she would reply with, "Mom, I can't even smell it." And she was right. We all know how this works. She had been spending so much time in her room that she got used to it and she stopped noticing it. Since I spend significantly less time in her room, the smell kept walloping me like a punch to the face every time I entered. So, what does this have to do with teaching? Well, kind of everything. We get to know our students really well. If I named any one of your students right now, you could probably tell me all kinds of things about them, like where they go to school and how they get along with their siblings and what kind of music they enjoy, and so on. You can also probably tell me their musical strengths and where they have the most room for improvement. This is all great, of course. I mean, we should know our students this well. But sometimes we become so familiar with them and so focused on what we know they do well and what we know they need to improve that we begin to miss obvious things. We have sat in the perfume ridden bedroom for too long, friends. And sometimes that means we miss things that should be obvious. I had such an instance just last weekend. And even though admitting my faults and shortcomings on the internet is one of my least favorite things to do, it's also kind of a trademark of this show. So rather than pretend to be the perfect piano teacher like I would like to be, here I am admitting that I too have apparently inhaled too much perfume. You know what I mean. So, last weekend, I had several students performing at a local competition. They did well. I was super proud of all of them. I have this one absolutely precious student who was playing Debussy's Girl with the Flaxen Hair. Friends, we had been working on all the things: super dynamic control, moving through long notes, how to shape the phrase when the tempo is so slow and notes are decaying left and right. I mean, you get the idea. And she played beautifully. But as I was sitting in the audience watching her perform, from the start, I saw something I had never noticed her doing before. And she played another piece a little bit later in the program, and I noticed the same thing there too, which led me to know that it was not a fluke, that she did indeed have a bad habit, a bad pedal habit. Yep, she was one of those. She was basically lifting her entire leg to change the pedal. Side note, if you are not a pianist, the issue here is this. When pedaling, the heel of our foot should always remain in contact with the floor, and we should simply flex the foot up and down to change the pedal rather than lifting our whole leg. There are a heap of reasons why this is important, but that's not the point of this episode. But I've got to say, this is something I tackle frequently with my students. I talk about it often. When I'm adjudicating other people's students, I almost always find myself making this same comment to young students. So, in short, this is something I actively watch for. It's like lesson number one of pedal technique. And yet, there she was, my student, no stranger to the pedal. I mean, she was playing Debussy, for goodness sakes. And by the way, yes, this leg pedal issue was the first thing her judge called her out for on her comment sheet. The good news is she still played well enough to win her division. But I was really thrown by this because, like, how had I missed it? The truth of the matter was, I was so focused on deeper issues that I missed something basic. I'm so used to her playing that I took her approach to pedaling for granted. I'd been in the perfumed room too long and I missed something. In her next lesson, it occurred to me that there was one more factor to my missing this issue. I quite literally needed a change of perspective. And that is where the inspiration for today's episode came from. Today, I am sharing 3 reminders, all related to perspective, that we should be putting to use before a performance. We all have our preferred teacher stance, right? Like for me, I generally stand to the right of my students while they play. I know a lot of you sit down. I'm a stander. I just have to move when I teach, and standing works for me for a lot of reasons. But I do generally try to change it up and wander around a little bit while I'm teaching too. When this student arrived for her follow up lesson after the competition, it dawned on me that I had not been intentional lately about watching her play from different angles. Aha! That was a big part of my problem here. My usual teaching stance doesn't make it particularly easy to watch what's going on with the right foot. So, anyway, that brings me to the first of 3 suggestions I have for you today. As you prepare for performances, it is incredibly important for you to watch your students play from different angles. If you typically stand, try sitting down. You really do see their physical approach to the instrument differently. And likewise, if you typically sit, try standing up and see what you notice. If space allows, try standing on the other side of your student or even standing directly behind them. You might be surprised what you learn about their shoulder alignment by watching them from behind. We need to be intentional about this one, friends. We will learn so much about our students by changing where we typically observe them from. This goes double for those of you who aren't teaching piano lessons. Have your students stand in a different location, play in a different room. Changes of physical perspective, especially when leading up to a performance, are such enlightening experiences. My second suggestion today is somewhat related to that, and most of you know this one. But when you are preparing for a performance, you should take a lot of videos. The primary reason that video recording helps performers is because it's the closest we can come to simulating the nervous conditions of performance. It doesn't matter if you are home alone and no one has a chance of hearing a single note from you. Once you hit that record button, your level of self awareness rises, and it's great practice for performance. But aside from that, reviewing video, like watching it back, is a really important thing to do to, change your perspective. I often talk to my students about what I call the time warp of performance. My best example of the time warp goes back to my high school days. Some of my friends and I were volunteering to play a concert at a nursing home, and I debuted a new arrangement of Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. Yep, we're talking the era of peak Titanic mania. So I played my piece and I felt pretty good about it until I sat back down. And my friends all looked at me and they said, "Whoa, that was so fast." Now, seeing as how so fast is not exactly the descriptor I was going for, I was a little disappointed. There happened to be a recording of that performance that day, and when I watched it back, I was floored at how much faster I was playing than I had realized. My left hand was flying through those accompaniment patterns. Like, whoa. Anyway, I tell you this story because it was the first time as a student I really understood how my perception of my performance tempo could be so drastically different than the tempo I was actually playing. Again, now I call that the time warp of performance. So, as teachers, we totally know this is a thing, right? But that's only so helpful because what we really need is for our students to understand. So, my second recommendation for you as you prepare for performances is yes, to make sure you are recording your students, but also make sure you are actively reviewing that footage together. And just like standing in a new location can change what you notice in your students playing, so can watching their performance on a screen. So, again, I confess to you, my student with this pedal issue in her WC, I had been recording her the weeks before her performance. But do you know what I did not do? I never watched them back. Recording itself is only half the job. Okay, so those are your first two suggestions for changing perspective before you play. The last perspective shift I have to offer involves making sure your student can pick up and begin at multiple places within their music. Whether your students are performing from memory or not, I'm team memorization, in case you wanted to know. But either way, students need to be able to start playing at different locations throughout their piece. This is one of those preparation strategies that can go such a long way to prevent disaster in performance. So, the old fashioned way of doing this is to designate what I always called jump spots in repertoire. So then you have your students practice starting at those various places in various ways. I mean, this is fine, it works. But I found out there's an even better way, especially when you have more than one instrument in your studio. So I would love to credit this idea to its original source, but the truth is, when the pandemic lockdowns hit, this was one of those life changing strategies that spread through online piano teacher groups like wildfire. The concept is what I've always called musical tag, and this was just such a winning addition to online lessons when we all needed every victory we could get. So the idea is this: I begin playing my student's piece. And then, without warning, I say, "Tag, you're it." And they have to pick up where I left off. Then you can let the student decide when to tag you back. Or if you're like me, you'll just jump back in and take over until I decide to tag them in again later in the piece. So, in doing so, we get to demonstrate all kinds of things: proper tempo, strong pulse, dynamics, articulations, all the things. But you also get to check and see if your student really knows their piece well enough to jump in from anywhere. It's very enlightening stuff. This game works really well online, obviously, but I have had lots of fun doing it in my studio physically as well. Some of my students are used to this idea by what they call popcorn reading in school. That's where they each take turns reading and then randomly select someone to take over next. So, either way, this is a great way to have some fun with our students while also helping them approach their music from a new perspective. And there you have it, friends. Three super practical ways to change perspective in your teaching, especially as you get ready for performance. I hope you are now inspired to observe your students literally from different angles, to record them and review those recordings together, and to try playing some musical tag this week. While you mull that over, let's wrap up with a toast, shall we? Oh, studio music teacher friends from all over the world. Today is a great day to ask yourself how you can approach your teaching from a different angle. Let's face it, it's a wild time of year, and it's really easy to feel kind of indifferent as the end of the school year draws closer. Shifting perspectives, whether that's physically or emotionally, is often just what we need to keep the wind in our sails. So, whether you're preparing for studio performances or not, I am raising my glass to you today, knowing that there is so much more to teaching than assigning repertoire. I see you and I see all of the work you're putting in. So keep it up. You are doing great. Cheers to you, my studio teacher friend. Here, here. If you would like to hear more of my thoughts on preparing for performance, there is a 3 episode series on that very thing. So go check out episodes 64 through 66. I will link them in the show notes for today's episode. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on recording yourself while teaching, you definitely need to listen to episode 120. That will be linked in the show notes for today as well. So, okay, friends, it is time for Teacher Friend of the Week. This week's TFOTW is Audrey Ellen Peters. Audrey Ellen is an alumnus from my Studio Foundations course. She's one of my email buddies, etc. She recently told me that her students are preparing for a Christmas in June recital, and I'm kind of obsessed with the genius of this whole thing. So, here, in these crazy spring weeks, Audrey Ellen told me that her students are mostly refreshing pieces that they learned back in December. It feels fun and special and also not altogether difficult. You guys, I just love this. First of all, the idea of learning pieces and then putting them away for a bit and then pulling them back out for a recital is often my idea of a perfect timeline. I've just never thought about doing it with Christmas pieces before. Like, how fun! And it fits right in with today's thought of changing perspectives. So, congrats to Andrea Ellen Peters for being Teacher Friend of the Week and for finding a way to ease up these stressful spring months. Who says Christmas recitals have to take place in December? Oh, I just love it. I hope Andrea Ellen's genius helps inspire you this week. One quick reminder before we go: if you appreciate the content on this podcast, I would love for you to check out the Beyond Measure community over on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can help make sure that I am able to continue prioritizing the time it takes to produce this show. For $6 a month, you will also score access to Teachers Teaching Teachers, which happens to have a new segment taking place this week. So go check out christinawhitlock.com/Patreon for all of those details, okay? All right. Until next time, my friends, onward and upward toward changing those perspectives.